A horrible night. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming. Thank you very much. So, what we're going to do tonight, you'll have seen from the promotional material that we're going to look at the historical and rational evidence for Jesus. Was Jesus' life, death, and resurrection actual historical events? So, to get started, I'm going to put two statements up on the screen. There's a historical and rational basis for Jesus being the Son of God, and there's a wealth of evidence to support that view. And the purpose of this evening is to provide, I guess, an introduction to this historical and rational evidence and draw some conclusions from the evidence presented. Clearly, in one evening, we're not going to be able to cover this in forensic detail. The pile of books you see on my former front lounge carpet are just a fraction of the books currently available on this topic. So, firstly, an apology if I seem to be skipping over certain topics that you might want to cover in more detail. There'll be an opportunity at the end to ask some questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. And you'll all get a copy of this booklet, the booklet. You'll get one of these at the end of the evening. That covers everything we're going to cover on the presentation, and then some. So, the plan for this evening is to review the sources of evidence we've got for Jesus, and I guess more importantly, ask whether these sources are reliable or not. After that, we'll spend a wee bit of time looking at what the sources of evidence say about Jesus. After a short break for tea and coffee, we'll look at the rest of the presentation will be evidence for the resurrection. Each half of the presentation will last about 40 minutes. As I said, at the end of the second half, I'll take questions from the floor, and we'll have a bit of a discussion about anything you want to discuss you've seen in the presentation. Good, right, so that's what we're going to do. But before I get going, I thought it'd be useful to tell you a wee bit about myself. I'm a Christian, but I used to be an agnostic. And I'm sorry to have to ask this, but I just want to double check. You all know what an agnostic is? Yes, I'm getting nods. Right, okay, good. The reason I'm asking that is I did this, I was just blithely saying, I was a resolute agnostic, and I've got a sea of blank faces at a presentation I did a couple of weeks, so I thought it'd be best asking. Anyway, right, so I was a resolute agnostic until my late 30s. I would never have classified myself as an atheist because I realized that atheism was a faith position. I really thought the only intellectually honest position that you could take was you don't know, and I didn't know. I really thought you couldn't know anything. Well, you couldn't know for certain about God and Jesus. Did God exist? Was Jesus who he said he was? I thought that was something that just you couldn't say for definite. So I guess through my 20s and my 30s, I had the view of many people in the UK today that I really didn't know what to think about God or Jesus. I suppose I thought you probably needed to have some sort of faith to be a Christian, and frankly, that faith was for other people. People maybe who'd been brought up Christians, or perhaps people who'd experienced some form of life-changing spiritual experience. Neither situation applied to me. However, in my late 30s, I thought it'd be useful or worthwhile revisiting some of the questions I'd left unresolved in my teens. My thoughts were there are plenty of capable, intelligent people who best have some sort of belief in God. For example, scientists like Albert Einstein, Francis Collins, ex-head of the US Genome Project. Other examples I saw were politicians like Nelson Mandela and military men like Norman Schwarzkopf and Richard Dannett. I remember reading a survey in Nature in 1997 which said 4 out of 10 scientists said they believed in God. Okay, just over 45% said they didn't believe, and 14.5% described themselves as doubters or agnostics. But a figure of 40% surprised me. Why did they believe? Also, if I looked at the religious leaders in this country, they were clearly intelligent men and women. If these people had some sort of belief in God, well, perhaps it was worthwhile looking at this again to try and find out why. So about this time, these thoughts were rolling around my head. I was on a business trip to the USA. I was sitting in the back of a car. We're traveling between Cleveland, Ohio, and Erie, Pennsylvania. It's about a 90-mile journey. I was sitting in the back of the car with a colleague. He was from California, and I was trying to be polite because we were going to be sitting next to each other for about an hour and a half. And I asked him where he'd been on holiday that year, and he told me he'd been over in Oxford in the UK on missionary work. I didn't think they sent missionaries to Oxford. Well, clearly they do from California. So that was kind of surprising. That sparked my curiosity. So I asked him a few of the questions that were rolling around in my head. And what he said, he did his best to answer them, but he said he'd send me a couple of books he thought would help with some of the questions I had. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I received a copy of The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel and a Bible through the post. Now, did reading The Case for Christ turn me into a Christian? Well, no, it didn't. But what it did do, though, was act as a starting point into my own investigation into who Jesus is. Frankly, I was amazed at what I found. I was amazed at my own ignorance of the evidence I found. How could I be living in a Christian country, in inverted commas, and not be aware of this stuff? So the reason I'm presenting this evening is I kind of think it's important to share the information I found with others and allow them to draw their own conclusions. Anyway, enough of me. Let's get into the meat of the presentation. Right, so what we're going to do, well, when you read the booklet, you'll get at the end of the presentation, you'll see about half of it is devoted to reviewing the sources of evidence we have for Jesus and assessing how reliable these sources are. For tonight, I've tried to provide a very brief summary of that. But before I do that, I just want to cover one topic. That is, there are plenty of people out there that think Jesus is purely mythical. Now, maybe some of you think of that in here. I don't know. I don't know what your beliefs are. But there are plenty of people out there that think that Jesus was mythical. Well, that's not the view of today's historians that specialize in this period of history. I pulled this straight off Wikipedia, and it says, like a pointer. There's a barrier there. I'll go here. Draw you over here. Right there. The historicity of Jesus is whether or not Jesus, the central figure of Christianity, historically existed, as opposed to being a purely mythical figure. Virtually all scholars of antiquity argue that Jesus existed. The contrary perspective, that Jesus was mythical, is regarded as a fringe theory. That's the view of today's historian, Christian and non-Christian, that specialise in this period of history. And there's a quote from a guy called Bart Ehrman. I don't know if you know who Bart Ehrman is. No? Okay, right. He's a prominent American Jesus scholar. He's also an agnostic. He wrote this book called Did Jesus Exist? And he wrote in it, whatever else you may think about Jesus, he certainly did exist. So, we're taking that as read this evening. I think it's a perfectly reasonable historical fact that Jesus actually existed. The question we're going to focus on is he who he said he was? Is he the Son of God? So that's what we're going to look at this evening. So, what sources of evidence do the historians use for the research on Jesus? Well, we've got the 4 Gospels in the Bible. We've got the letters of Paul, James, and Jude in the Bible. We've got the Gospels of Jesus that didn't make it into the Bible, often called the Apocryphal Gospels. We've got written sources from outside the Bible, dated to shortly after Jesus' life. We have archaeological evidence, and we've got circumstantial evidence. Now, I think the most often overlooked is that No, it doesn't. Right, good. Of these, the most often overlooked is that last point, circumstantial evidence. I'd like to just think about this briefly for a minute. Christianity has existed on this planet for a very long time. Christianity has got more followers today than any other religion on earth. However, we know there was a time when there were no Christians on this planet. So why are there Christians today? Well, rational cause and effect tells us that at some point in the past, something must have happened, some cause that had the effect of compelling some people who weren't the first Christians to become the first Christians. Now, that might sound like stating the obvious, and I suppose it is. But for all of us, atheists, agnostics, Christians, those of other faiths, that provides a direct challenge. Christianity, Christianity, the start of Christianity is a historical event. So when and why Christianity started can be studied like any other historical event. Historians of all faiths and no faith have been doing this very thing for about 200 years. The key point we mustn't lose sight of is that something pretty momentous happened to cause some people who weren't the first Christians to become the first Christians. Something had to happen to start it all in the first place, and given all the historical research that's been directed to finding out what happened, all of us, you, me, can come to our own informed view of what we think happened. So let's have a very brief look at the sources historians use for their research. Let's start with the Gospels. Okay, when I was an agnostic, I thought the Gospels were theological texts written hundreds of years after the time Jesus was supposed to have lived, and the Gospels we read today were substantially revised and doctored versions of what had probably been written in the first place. In other words, they couldn't be used as the basis for historical research on Jesus. Well, what I was surprised to find is that that isn't the view of today's historians that specialize in this period of history. So, what the current view is, like the Gospel of Mark, that was written around 60 to 70 AD. That's about 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. But the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, written some 10 to 15 years after Mark. The Gospel of John, written around about AD 90. What I was surprised to find was that there are many thousands of early Gospel manuscripts, some from as early as the 2nd century AD, that exist today. I was also surprised to find when these documents are compared using a technique that historians use called textual criticism, it's found that these documents look to be pretty accurate versions of what was originally written. In other words, historians are of the view that the Gospels haven't been substantially altered, either deliberately to fit in with later theology or accidentally as part of the handwritten copying process to produce documents before the invention of printing in the Middle Ages. Okay, so historians can tell us that the Gospels are pretty accurate versions of what was originally written. But are the Gospels accurate descriptions of what actually happened? Well, the answer in part, I think, comes from the dates the Gospels were written. As I said a minute ago, the first Gospel, Mark, was written around 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. Now, life expectancy was shorter then, but when the Gospels were written, there would still be a good chance that some of the people who had actually seen and heard Jesus would still be alive. In short, there'd be still first-hand witnesses for Jesus' life available to draw upon for information, and of course to challenge what was written down if it was inaccurate. Also, a span of 30 to 40 years really doesn't give much time for legends and myths to develop about Jesus. There's a general rule amongst historians that the longer the time period between an event occurring and it being written about, the greater the chances of legendary material getting into the narrative. So the 30 to 40 year time span we have with Jesus is, in historical terms, fairly short. For comparison, the earliest biographies we have of Alexander the Great were written more than 400 years after his death, written by Arrian and Plutarch. Now, these are the biographies that we base our knowledge of Alexander the Great upon. So from a historian's perspective, there's a very good chance that the Gospels are pretty accurate representations of Jesus' life, given they were written very shortly after the actual events being described. Okay. But what about the differences in the Gospels? Now, there's well known that there are a number of apparent differences in the Gospel. I'm saying apparent because these differences can be explained away. I suppose it would have been easier if they weren't there in the first place, but they're there. For example, the number of people that find Jesus' tomb empty varies between the Gospels. The detail of the birth narrative varies between the Gospels. There isn't a birth narrative at all in Mark's Gospel and John's Gospel. The order of some of the events in Jesus' life seems to vary from Gospel to Gospel. In one Gospel, we find Jesus' mother Mary being told clearly that the child she's about to give birth to is the Son of God. Yet in another Gospel, we're told that Jesus' mother and the family tried to stop him in his ministry, saying that he was out of his mind. Does that not reduce the credibility of the information in that Gospel? Well, extensive analysis of the Gospels by historians over the last couple of hundred years has led to the consensus view the Gospels are written at least semi-independently and were drawing from oral histories of more than one early Christian community. Unsurprisingly, then, there'll be slight variations between those oral histories, and that would be reflected in the Gospels. Also, as John's Gospel was written once Christianity and Christian theology was more developed, it's unsurprising that is reflected in that Gospel. However, what I think is surprising is that these differences exist in the Bibles we read today. What this clearly tells us is that these awkward differences have been left in, lending evidential weight to the view that the Gospels we read today are accurate versions of what was originally written. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about Gospel reliability tonight. Time doesn't allow me to go into any more depth than that. As I say, when you get the booklet, there's plenty more about gospel reliability in here. So another source of evidence we've got are Paul's letters. Paul wrote to various early Christian communities in Rome and other locations in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Now, these were written around 15 to 25 years after Jesus died. So, all Paul's letters predate the Gospels. There's also a consensus view amongst historians that the majority of the letters of Paul in the Bible were genuinely written by Paul. Now, that's not to say the other letters are forgeries. It just means there's more historical debate as to the authorship of these documents. So they may well be genuine, but there's just a bit of debate on them. But there is a core of letters in the Bible that historians are all agreed were actually written by Paul. In the letters, there's clear evidence that Christian worship and belief were already well developed. Well, logic tells us this must have happened earlier than 15 to 25 years after Jesus died. One example of this is a passage from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is one of the letters that historians are confident was actually written by Paul. And it says, "Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you've received and which you've taken your stand. By this gospel you're saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you've believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and then he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one normally born. Okay, well, why is that passage important? As I mentioned before, Paul's letter to the Corinthians is regarded by historians as genuine. The passage we've just seen and heard is also regarded by historians as genuine. In other words, it doesn't look like a later addition. Of course, what it shows is that at least as early as 15 to 25 years after Jesus' death, and most likely earlier than that, the central message of Christianity was the death and resurrection of Jesus and what it meant. Okay, that's all I'm going to talk about Paul's letters tonight. We go into it in far more depth in the booklet you'll get at the end of the evening. Another source of evidence we've got are these apocryphal gospels. Now, there are many other accounts, or gospels, if you like, of Jesus' life that aren't in the Bible. Some of these early other gospels have survived to the present day, and they're available for both historians and the general public, you and me, to read and study. You might have heard about 10 years ago, archaeologists dug up the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. This is one of many other Gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, and so on. These apocryphal Gospels, as they're known, were either written well into the 2nd century or later. Now, they often contain more fanciful and supernatural accounts of Jesus' life, just as historians might expect from that rule of thumb we described a minute ago. That is, the longer the time period elapsing between an event occurring and it being written about, the greater the chances of legendary material getting into the narrative. Now, historians use these apocryphal Gospels for studying the life of Jesus. However, they're probably more useful for studying the beliefs of the 2nd and 3rd century Christian communities that they sprung from. Okay, contemporary non-Christian written sources. Now, a reasonable question to ask is, why are there no surviving documents describing Jesus' life from non-Christian sources from the time of Jesus? The argument goes, if the events of Jesus' life were so momentous, why were they not written about by other writers at the time? Well, although we don't ultimately know for definite why this is, we suggest that in the booklet that the likely answer is rather mundane if we consider who might have recorded this. That is, the Jewish, Roman, and Greek scribes writing for the Jewish and Roman authorities. I think from a Jewish and Roman authorities perspective, Jesus would be seen as just another Jewish holy man who stirred up the Jews in Jerusalem and was quickly dealt with before he could cause any real trouble. These events were occurring in a tiny part of the Roman Empire where this kind of thing happened regularly. I think it would hardly worthy of mention. Now, this slide here, what I wanted to do when I was putting this presentation together, I was interested to find out what was going on in the Roman Empire about the time of Jesus' mission. And there was quite a lot. As you can see, they were fighting Germanic tribes up here. How do you pronounce that? I thought it was Dacians. But then again, there's a car called a Dacian. What do you call it? People aren't helping me here. I need to know how. I've never heard it pronounced properly. Anyway, they were fighting these unpronounceable people up here. This was caused a major disruption in the Roman Empire. Basically, the Emperor Tiberius had gone into semi-retirement and had put de facto control of the empire in the hands of this fella, Sejanus, who was the head of the Praetorian Guard. Then what Sejanus then did was he appointed a series of placemen around the empire that were loyal to him to control the empire. About 31 AD, the emperor decided that Sejanus was getting a bit too big for his boots, and decided to have Sejanus murdered. And of course, all the placemen around the empire were all desperate to show their loyalty to the emperor Tiberius, and that was making them very nervous, you can imagine. So that might explain why in John's Gospel you get the Jewish authorities saying to Pontius Pilate, this man, pointing to Jesus, claims to be king of the Jews. We've only got one king, but King Caesar. If you let this man live, you're no friend of Caesar's. That's what they say to the Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate really didn't pay much attention to what the Jewish authorities usually said, but he paid attention to that. Obviously, he was concerned that by questioning his loyalty, if that get back to the emperor, things might not go too well for Pontius Pilate. So that might be something to do with it. I'm not saying it is. We can maybe talk about that later if you want to. Anyway, I think you'd agree that all these things up there are all far more important from a Roman perspective than some itinerant Jewish preacher causing a bit of trouble in the bottom right-hand corner of the empire. Now, if the Jewish authorities had written about Jesus, well, the documents would have had to survive the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and AD 135. Now, I won't go into the details of the Jewish uprisings at this time and the Roman response, other than to say the Romans ultimately flattened the city, destroyed the Jewish temple completely, and either killed or scattered the Jewish inhabitants. Not ideal conditions for the survival of documents, particularly in Jewish eyes, less important non-sacred documents. Okay, is that it? Well, no. Although there are no reliable early non-Christian documents describing Jesus' life, there are a number of non-Christian documents describing Jesus' early followers. In the booklet, we provide a far more extensive review of these documents and what they say. However, for tonight, there's just one reference I'd like to focus on, and that is Tacitus. In 115 AD, Tacitus wrote a history of Rome. He describes how Nero persecuted Christians as scapegoats to divert suspicion away from himself for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. What does that admittedly brief mention of Christians tell us? Well, one thing it tells us is there were sufficient numbers of people who saw themselves as Christians in Rome in 64 AD to be singled out for attention by Nero. Now, if you think about this, to be a persecuted minority, there have to be sufficient numbers of those people who saw themselves there have to be sufficient numbers of that minority to come to the attention of the majority. Use a contemporary example. Consider asylum seekers in the UK. Now, there have been people seeking asylum in the UK for hundreds of years, way back to the late 18th century. But they've only begun to be seen as a group called asylum seekers when their numbers grew significantly around the turn of the millennium. So the reference in Tacitus tells us that less than 35 years after Jesus died, there was a Christian community large enough and vocal enough to be noticed by the emperor and worthy of persecution in Rome. Okay, let's move on to archaeology. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about archaeology tonight, other than I'll talk about this, the picture on the left-hand side there. But all I want to say is that archaeological finds from Judea and Galilee provide a generally supportive picture of the details that appear in the Gospels and letters of Paul. I'll just use this example here. That's a foot bone. Okay? I've got a nail through it. And that's a reconstruction of a foot with a nail through it. That was found in a Jewish tomb in Jerusalem. Now, prior to that bone being found, if you'd asked historians that specialise in this period of history what happened to crucifixion victims, they would have said that they were thrown on the municipal rubbish dump outside Jerusalem, where they were eaten by wild animals and dogs. Finding of that bone in a Jewish tomb indicates that at least one person received a proper Jewish burial after he was crucified. Now, that's obviously not Jesus' bone, but what it does is it provides corroborating evidence for what's in the Gospels. That was a point of conflict prior to that bone being found. So these then are the sources of evidence that historians, you and I, can draw upon to understand who Jesus was and is. So when examining the evidence, what do today's historians agree upon regarding the life of Jesus? Well, when I was doing my research into who Jesus is, I read a book by the historian Professor E.P. Sanders called The Historical Figure of Jesus. Sanders was regarded as a leading figure in the research on the historical Jesus. He died a couple of years ago. This particular book was written in 1993. Now, the only reason I mention it is because Sanders provides in the book a few brief statements about Jesus, which he says, to quote him directly, are almost beyond dispute amongst historians. So these are: Jesus was born circa 4 BCE, near the time of death of Herod the Great. He spent his childhood and early adult years in Nazareth, a Galilean village. He was baptized by John the Baptist. He called disciples. He taught in the towns, villages, and countryside of Galilee, but apparently not the cities. He preached the kingdom of God. About the year 30 or 33 AD, he went to Jerusalem for Passover. He created a disturbance in the temple area, had a final meal with his disciples. He was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest, and he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Now, Sanders then goes on to provide a short list of what he refers to as a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. Again, these are historical facts that the majority of today's historians are agreed actually happened after Jesus' death. These are: the disciples first fled. The disciples saw Jesus, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As a consequence, they believed he would return to found the kingdom. And they formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. Now, I wonder if any of you find that list surprising. I know I did when I first read it as an agnostic. I was surprised to find that the accepted historical view of Jesus' life and its aftermath was so close to being what I understood to be the biblical view. Now, when we look at evidence for the resurrection later on, I'll come back to this list along with some of the circumstantial threads of evidence regarding early Christianity I've touched on so far. However, before this, I'd like to briefly look at what the sources tell us about Jesus himself. The sources indicate that Jesus' disciples thought he was the Son of God and Messiah. Well, were they correct? Now, for an atheist and agnostic, it's hard to get your head around the idea that the historical figure of Jesus is also the Son of God. Is Christianity therefore based on some massive misunderstanding of who Jesus was? Well, I'd like to take a few minutes to look at what the sources tell us about who Jesus was and is. Okay, it's sometimes suggested that although Jesus saw himself as a teacher and Jewish holy man, he didn't regard himself as the Son of God. Some have claimed that as a good Jew, Jesus would have regarded such a view of himself as blasphemous. Well, to address that question, I picked a couple of examples from Mark's Gospel. You'll remember that earlier on this evening, I told you Mark was the Gospel written first, some 30 to 40 years after Jesus' death. I've chosen examples from Mark's Gospel to reduce the possibility of Christian theology getting in the way of developing an accurate picture of Jesus' view of himself. Now, when we look at Mark's Gospel, I think we can see clear evidence of Jesus thinking and acting in a manner consistent with his believing he's the Son of God. For example, In Mark's Gospel, Jesus forgives sins. In the miracle narratives, Jesus sometimes links the physical and mental affliction of the person about to be healed with that person's sinfulness. For example, in Mark chapter 2, he says, "Son, your sins are forgiven," as a precursor to the healing of a paralyzed man. Now, as any good Jew knew, only God can forgive sins. Jesus knew the Jewish scriptures, and teaching and acting in this way, he was directly linking himself with God. In Mark, it says that the Jewish religious authorities also realized this and accused him of blasphemy as a result. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus teaches on his own authority. Now, this might appear as a bit of a technicality, but in Judaism, you required two people to conduct religious teaching, one to witness what the other was saying, and vice versa. Jesus, however, makes a point of teaching alone. He precedes many of his teaching with the words, "I tell you the truth." Well, so what, you might say? Well, any other Jewish teacher in the first century would say something like, "I tell you the truth," and here's a teacher standing next to me that'll verify I'm telling the truth. So why is that important? Well, a Jewish audience would know that only God can teach on his own authority. Again, Jesus is directly linking himself with God by teaching in this particular way. Also in Mark's Gospel, he refers to God as Father, or Abba. That's Aramaic for dad or daddy. So what, you might say again, isn't God regularly referred to as Father in the Christian church? It doesn't mean that Christians believe that God is their actual biological father. Now, I guess the problem here is that we're used to a Christian view having an intimate father-child relationship with God. A relationship, of course, modeled in Jesus' relationship with God. As a result, it's been common in the last 2,000 years to refer to God as Father. However, to first century Jews, calling God Father would be blasphemous. Jews weren't even allowed to mention God's name, that is the tetragram YHWH. So to refer to God as Dad or Daddy, Abba, would have been seen by Jews as downright eccentric, as well as, of course, blasphemous, unless, of course, you actually were God's son. Okay. The miracles also in Mark's Gospel had symbolic meaning to those that were performed in front of. They were performed in such a way as to link Jesus to such Jewish figures as Moses, Elijah, Joshua, and so on. Now, another miracle, the calming of the storm, also suggested to those that witnessed it that Jesus was God. In this event, Jesus and his disciples are in an open boat by the Sea of on the Sea of Galilee when they're caught in a violent storm. As the wind and waves rage and the boat begins to fill with water, Jesus is sleeping on the back of the boat in a cushion. The disciples wake him up shouting, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Jesus then gets up, shouts at the waves, "Quiet, be still," and at that, the storm immediately abates. Jesus then gives his disciples a hard time for the lack of faith in him. Now, at this time, Jews believed that only God had control of the elements. Further, Jews believed that Satan's home was under the waters of seas and lakes. For Jesus to take control of the wind and waves in this way was a clear sign to his followers that it was God, and of course that he had control over Satan. No wonder the disciples were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." Well, in summary, I think it's fair to say that these points don't provide conclusive proof that Jesus is the Son of God. However, it certainly indicates that it was very likely he thought of himself in that particular way. Okay, I think we'd agree. If somebody today said they were the Son of God, we'd think they were massively deluded. So, was Jesus also severely deluded to think of himself in that way? Well, in the booklet, we'll look at what psychologists think of Jesus' mental condition when they review the sources we have. And the conclusion they come to, and we come to, is there's no direct evidence or even hints of evidence suggesting Jesus was exhibiting any of the behavior patterns associated with delusional behavior. Okay. So it looks from the sources of evidence that Jesus saw himself as the Son of God, and there are no clues to suggest he was massively deluded. However, what if he unintentionally misled the disciples? What if he sincerely believed he was the Son of God, but was just wrong? Alternatively, what if he deliberately misled the disciples? What if he had some other agenda for saying he was the Son of God? What if all those miracles were actually sleight of hand, deceptions, magic tricks, and so on? These are all reasonable questions. I'll spend a couple of minutes touching each one individually. Let's cover the first one. Did Jesus unintentionally mislead his followers? Well, earlier we discussed whether Jesus was severely deluded, mad if you prefer, to think he was the Son of God. My guess is we're all probably quite comfortable with concluding Jesus didn't have serious mental health problems. But what if he unintentionally misled his followers? What if he sincerely believed he was the Son of God but was just wrong? Now, this is a common argument put forward by non-Christians. To quote our old friend Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, page 92 of the hardback version, if you want to check, Richard Dawkins writes, a fourth possibility, almost too obvious to need mentioning, that Jesus was honestly mistaken, Son of God. Plenty of people are honestly mistaken about all kinds of things. Well, indeed. Plenty of people are honestly mistaken about all kinds of things. It doesn't make them mad. I've been honestly mistaken about all kinds of things in my life. However, if I stood up here right now, looked at you in a focused kind of way, and said, I'm the Son of God. No, I'm not kidding. I'm the Son of God. I know it's probably a bit difficult to get your head around what with this lack of hair and this accent and this wee check shirt, but I'm the Son of God. Well, what would you think? Probably the most polite thing you would think is I probably need to have a wee sit down and have a drink of water. I'll just have a wee drink of water just now. This is the time for a wee drink of water. So what am I saying? I'm saying you can't have it both ways. If you think you're God, then you're either wrong in the head or you are God. Further, if you think you're God and are prepared to do something about it, like Jesus, which involves going on a mission, collects followers, challenges the established religious order, and ends up getting you and most of your followers killed, then you really are wrong in the head or God. Okay, from what I've just said there, it's pretty unlikely he unintentionally misled his followers. Well, could he have deliberately done that? What if all those miracles were elaborate hoaxes and sleight of hand magic tricks and so on and so forth? Now, we know of some other charismatic and messianic leaders in the past who have deliberately misled their followers. Could Jesus have done something similar? Now, these two characters up here, you know who they are? Yeah, David Koresh and Jim Jones? What? Don't know Jim Jones, right? Okay. David Koresh was the head of the Branch Davidian cult in Waco, and Jim Jones was also the Rana cult down in Guyana, where he took a whole lot of Americans, and I provided a couple of potted biographies of Jim Jones and David Koresh in the booklet. What I'd suggest you do is read those potted biographies, have a look at Jesus in the Gospels, read the Gospels for yourself. There's no comparison between Jesus and these monsters. There's just no comparison. Jesus doesn't look anything like these fellas. And the thing about it is, if you're prepared to mislead people, then you're probably prepared to do a whole lot of other things as well, as these guys did. So it just doesn't look like Jesus. So the conclusion we come to, there's nothing in the sources of evidence suggesting Jesus misled his disciples. So it looks like Jesus thought he was the Son of God. It looks like he wasn't mad or delusional. It's very unlikely he knowingly or unknowingly misled the disciples. So what are we left with? Well, maybe. just maybe, he was who he said he was. What I'd like to do now, though, is have a short break. After that break, I'd like to move on to the one key event on which the existence of Christianity rests. That is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Is there compelling evidence to support the resurrection being an actual historical event? Thank you. Right, okay, to start our look at the evidence for the resurrection, I'd like to return to that list of events in the life of Jesus from that historian E.P. Sanders' book, The Historical Figure of Jesus. You'll remember from earlier on this evening that we went through a list of what Sanders refers to as a list of secure facts about the life and death of Jesus and the aftermath of Jesus' life. As I said, these are historical facts that the majority of today's historians are agreed actually happened before and after Jesus' death. So let me repeat the last few bullet points in Sanders' list. So about the year 30 or 33 AD, he went to Jerusalem for Passover. He created a disturbance in the temple area. In a final meal with his disciples, he was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest, and he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Sanders then goes on to provide, as I said, a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. These are: the disciples first fled, the disciples saw Jesus, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As a consequence, they believed they would return to found the kingdom. And they formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. So I guess the purpose of the remainder of this evening is to focus on that third last bullet point. So today's historians, both Christian and non-Christian, are agreed that something happened to convince the disciples they'd seen Jesus after his death. So what did the disciples see and experience? Well, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Medical knowledge, our understanding of biology and physics, our own personal experience just tell us that people don't come back to life again after they die. So we might think, surely there's some other explanation. Well, what we'll do now is have a look at some of the more common alternative explanations and see how they sit with the evidence we have for what happened. So was Jesus really executed? One explanation could be it's pretty easy to appear to your disciples after your death if you didn't die in the first place. So was he really executed? Could he have been taken down off the cross before he died, then revived later? Now, at first glance, this doesn't look too implausible. We've all heard of people who've been pronounced dead, then to everyone's surprise, revived some hours or days later in the mortuary or hospital, like this fella here. There's a guy called Walter Williams. He died in Alabama in 2014. He was in the mortuary on that gurney with that body bag over the top of him when the mortician heard scratching from underneath the body bag. The mortician unzipped the body bag, and there's Walter Williams recovering in hospital. So if this kind of thing can happen occasionally today, well, what about 2,000 years ago, when the medical knowledge was more primitive? Could the Romans who have executed Jesus have made a mistake? Alternatively, what if the whole thing was faked? Was the crucifixion somehow stage managed as some form of diversion to allow Jesus to escape? So, response to the was Jesus really executed? Historians and archaeologists can tell us quite a lot about Roman torture and execution techniques. I won't go into the gory details here. There are plenty of internet sites, books and TV programs on the very subject if you're interested. Now, what our knowledge of Roman torture and execution tells us. is that it was very, very unlikely that anyone survived a Roman crucifixion. Now, we do know of one or two examples from other historical sources that it did happen, but it was a very, very rare occurrence. Now, even if Jesus could have been taken down before he died and the nails taken out of his wrists and feet, he would have been unable to use his hands and he wouldn't have been able to walk. It's very unlikely Jesus would have made a full recovery. Also, he wasn't executed by amateurs. Roman soldiers did the job. Now, they might not have had 21st century medical knowledge. They knew exactly how to kill somebody. That's what they were trained to do. They were professional career killers. Also, he was executed in the orders of the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. One argument goes that perhaps the soldiers had been bribed by persons unknown not to kill Jesus. Instead, they were to stage manage some fake execution. Now, firstly, that would have been pretty difficult, as it was a public crucifixion, as all crucifixions were. That was the whole point, to act as a warning to others not to disturb the Roman order. Secondly, if that had been found out, the soldiers would have disobeyed a direct command from the Roman ruler of Judea. A slow and painful death would have been the inevitable result. Also, the sources we discussed earlier all agree that Jesus was tortured and flogged before he was crucified. So in short, just suppose there was some plot to get him off the cross. Just suppose there was some plot to be able to survive the crucifixion. What kind of condition would he have been in? Hardly an impressive sight for the disciples a few days later. Hardly an inspiration for the disciples then to go and spread the message of a risen Christ triumphing over death throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. So, in summary, it's highly unlikely that Jesus survived his crucifixion. It's also highly unlikely that the whole thing was stage managed either. However, as you might be aware, the fake crucifixion theory has had some popular currency over the last few years. If you've read the book or seen the film of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, you know that one theory is that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Instead, he escapes to southern France, along with his wife, Mary Magdalene, apparently. In southern France, their children intermarry with the Merovingians, thus creating a holy bloodline the Catholic Church has been trying to suppress ever since. Now, that theory is based on an earlier book by Bagent, Lee and Lincoln. That's the book up in the top right-hand corner there. Called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. Now, we could spend some time this evening looking at the pros and cons of this theory. However, that would be going over ground well covered in the numerous books and articles written on that subject currently available. Instead, I think I can say that this theory is just that, theory. Whilst there are historically factual elements to the theory, other facts are ignored. There's also a large amount of speculation required to arrive at the conclusions the books and film make. Now, if this is an area of interest to you, I would suggest you read the books and articles on the subject currently available. A simple internet search will get you going. I think a review of these items you'll find, demonstrate where this theory really has no serious takers amongst the overwhelming majority of today's historians. Okay. So it would look like most likely that Jesus was executed. What happened to his dead body? This is important to consider. Clearly, it would have been difficult to explain Jesus being alive after his death if his corpse was still in its tomb. The gospel account is that he was executed, he was prepared for burial, and placed in a rock-caved tomb. On the third day after his death, some of his female followers went to the tomb. They found the tomb open and Jesus' body missing. As I mentioned earlier, although the documentary evidence of the gospel seems to vary in some of the details of the empty tomb, this event is present in all four gospels. Clearly, early Christians believed that his body had disappeared from earth so that he could come back alive again to his followers. Okay, well, are there any other explanations why his body might have been missing? Well, maybe the best way of looking at this is approaching this is to try and find a motive for somebody to do that. Who could have removed the body from the tomb, and what would their motive be for doing so? Well, I guess the Romans could have. And the Romans' main concern was maintaining order in Jerusalem. Their motivation for executing Jesus, as we've seen, was in direct consequence to the disturbance Jesus, or direct response to the disturbance Jesus had created in the temple area. This disturbance created the unrest the Romans were always seeking to avoid in this very volatile part of the empire. Now, Jesus had some very devoted followers. Perhaps the Romans were concerned that by leaving Jesus' body in the tomb, it would become a shrine to Jesus and a focal point for further unrest. Now, this line of thought does have some modern parallels. For example, at the end of the Second World War, the Russian army discovered Hitler's dead body in his burned-out bunker in Berlin. However, they took the body and destroyed it completely so that it could not be buried. Their concern was that Hitler's grave would become a focal point for further Nazi sympathizers in the future. However, what undermines this theory is that very shortly after Jesus' death, his followers are going around saying he's risen from the dead. They're making a nuisance of themselves and causing the very disorder the Romans were trying to avoid. Indeed, the Romans spent the next 300 odd years trying to suppress the disorder that developed through the empire as a result of this one event. So, to nip it all in the bud, to stop it all getting out of hand, if the Romans had taken Jesus' body, well, would they not have produced it? Now, you remember from the first half, a common fate for corpses of crucifixion victims was that they were thrown in the municipal rubbish dump outside Jerusalem, where they were eaten by wild animals and dogs. If that's what the Romans had done with Jesus' body, they might not have had it to produce. However, it had been a relatively simple thing to publicly state that that is what had happened to the body. However, we've got no direct evidence or even hints of evidence that anything like that actually happened. We have to conclude it's very unlikely the Romans were responsible for the empty tomb. Okay, that's the Romans. What about the Jewish authorities? Well, I guess their reason for removing the body and the counter-arguments are pretty much the same as the Romans. What about the disciples? Would they have a motive for taking Jesus' body? Also, this would look to be unlikely. I personally can't think of a motive they might have for doing that. Also, the disciples believed that Jesus was raised from the dead and were prepared to die for that belief. Frankly, in most cases, they did die for that belief. If they had taken the body, why then would they make up the raised from the dead story and be prepared to die in defense of it? It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, what about grave robbers? Now, to me, the idea that grave robbers stole Jesus' body looks like more of a possibility. Grave robbing did occur at that time. Robbers were usually looking for the valuable goods, sometimes buried with a body. In fewer cases, they were looking for the body itself or body parts for use in magic rituals. Well, was there anything to steal? The synoptic Gospels, that's the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, mention that Jesus' body was wrapped in a linen cloth. No grave goods are mentioned. Grave robbers usually steal the goods buried with a body, not the decomposing body itself. Now, John's Gospel mentions about 34 kilograms of myrrh and aloes, which were wrapped in the linen cloth round Jesus' body. Now, that would have been worth stealing. However, John's Gospel also tells us that Jesus' grave clothes were in the tomb, with the burial cloth neatly folded, when the disciples entered the tomb and found Jesus' body missing. That doesn't really fit with the grave robbing theory. If you were robbing a grave of spices wrapped tightly into the linen binding around a dead body, it would make sense to take the body somewhere else, unwrap the body, take the spices, or do exactly the same thing in the tomb. In the first scenario, there'd have been no grave clothes in the tomb or body. In the second scenario, there would have been a body and the grave clothes in the tomb. Neither situation is described in John's Gospel. Now, we know from a few Roman and Greek sources that dead human bodies or body parts were sometimes used for magic rituals around the Roman Empire. However, the practice wasn't rife, and we have no evidence that this occurred within the Jewish part of the Roman Empire. Indeed, Jews would find this kind of behavior abhorrent. This burial occurred in Jerusalem, the most Jewish of Jewish towns and cities. That makes the concept of a stolen body for the purposes of magic even less likely than if the burial had occurred in, say, Rome or Athens or Alexandria or somewhere like that. So nobody seems to have a strong motive for taking the body or keeping it a secret if they had. Now, I think one further point worth making on this subject. The disciples of Jesus were the founders of what we know as Christianity. After the resurrection, they didn't go to some obscure place miles away from where it all happened to preach about the resurrection. No, they came back to Jerusalem, the very place of Jesus' execution and tomb. Fundamental to their preaching was the empty tomb of Jesus. If this preaching had been false, it would have been clearly evident to some people in Jerusalem. Some people would be bound to know where Jesus' tomb was and or what had happened to the body. Indeed, he was buried in the tomb of a prominent member of the Sanhedrin. That's the Jewish ruling council. That's Joseph of Arimathea. So somebody would have been bound to know where Joseph's tomb was. So in conclusion, I suppose I can't say there's any concrete evidence to demonstrate that Jesus' body left earth as the disciples claimed. However, I think what is clearer is that his body disappeared, and that those with a vested interest in claiming it was still on earth, that is the Romans and the temple authorities, couldn't prove it actually was. Okay, was Jesus seen alive? At the start of this half of the evening, I mentioned E.P. Sanders' secure fact that Jesus' disciples saw him, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As we saw, Sanders says this because historians are of the majority view that Jesus' disciples saw him after his death. I guess what historians are less certain about is the in what sense part of the statement. Okay, what do the letters of Paul and the Gospels say? Well, there's more than one appearance event in the Bible. There are 11 separate and distinct appearance events described. These happen to individuals, groups of people, and in one case, 500 people. They happen over a period of 40 days after Jesus' death, with the exception of his appearance to Paul, which happened much later. The Gospels are clear that Jesus was with them physically. He could eat, drink, be touched, and be conversed with. But he could also appear and disappear at will. Often in the appearance events, the disciples don't seem to immediately recognize the person they're with as Jesus. Now, as I said earlier on this evening, in the rational 21st century, difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Our medical knowledge, our understanding of biology and physics, our own personal experience all tell us that people just don't come back to life after they die. So, are there any other possible explanations for what the disciples saw other than the risen Christ? Well, did they see a ghost? Now, for us in the rational 21st century, this is probably about as hard to grasp as seeing the resurrected Jesus. However, the descriptions of a physical Jesus that could eat, drink, and be touched doesn't sound like a spectral appearance. Okay, well, he's subject to some form of hysteria. Now, the followers of Jesus would have been very distraught after his death. Now, that can make people a bit irrational and unstable. Is it possible that seeing Jesus alive again was all in their mind? Some form of mass hallucination, some sort of fevered imagination, some sort of wish fulfillment? Well, in response to that, our knowledge of psychology tells us that hallucinations are individual occurrences. They aren't something that can happen to groups of people at the same time. Now, I could be up here having a hallucination. I'm not, by the way, but I could be, right? Imagine me. You can't have my hallucination. It's impossible. It's physically impossible. It can't happen. Also, there are multiple appearances of Jesus over a period of 5 weeks to different people and to the same people more than once to be explained. Now, having just said what I said about hallucinations, you can just about imagine a group of people grieving in a room together might work themselves up into such an emotional frenzy that they were all able to convince each other they saw the person they were grieving over. Well, could the appearance events fit with something like that? Well, if I'm honest, the circumstances of one or two could. Although, if I'm also honest, there's nothing in the sources hinting that anything like this actually happened. For the rest, the actual appearance descriptions in the Gospels just don't fit with some form of hysterical event. For example, 2 disciples are walking to a village called Emmaus in broad daylight. They're chatting when suddenly Jesus appears with them. The disciples are out catching fish in the Sea of Galilee. As they come ashore, Jesus is waiting for them and has cooked breakfast for them. In another, Jesus appears to more than 500 people at the same time. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are 11 separate appearance events in the documentary evidence we've got. When these are studied and dissected, there's little or no evidence to suggest that hysteria played a part in the appearance events. So, another possible reason could be, did the disciples just make it all up? Well, as I mentioned before, nearly all the disciples met violent deaths proclaiming Jesus as the risen Son of God. Frankly, they just wouldn't have done that if they'd made the whole thing up. So, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, these historians, Christian and non-Christian, specializing in first century Near Eastern history, are of the majority view that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. So, in what sense did they see Jesus? Well, it's unlikely they saw a ghost. It's unlikely they suffered some form of hysterical event. It's unlikely they made it all up. So, as I've said a few times this evening, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Pretty implausible. Frankly, it just doesn't happen. But historians tell us that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. We've looked at various explanations for this. By deduction, it would seem that the least unlikely explanation is they actually saw Jesus alive after his death. By deduction, the other explanations just look even more implausible than that. Okay, so analysis of the evidence we've looked at so far points to the resurrection being an actual historical event. Is there any other evidence we should consider? Well, I think the answer is a clear yes. Consider the following. The disciples died for the belief. Now, we've touched on this a few minutes ago. Let's consider this in a bit more detail. You might say, well, so what? Countless people have died for their beliefs since the disciples. Frankly, for thousands of years, people have been enthusiastically dying for what they sincerely believe in. From the suffragette Emily Davison to Bobby Sands in Northern Ireland, to the suicide bombers of Iraq, Israel, and Afghanistan, to the terrorists involved in the London tube bombings, to the Jews of the Spanish Inquisition. These are just a few of the countless numbers of people who have died for their sincerely held beliefs since the disciples. However, there's one key difference with the disciples. The disciples sincerely believed that Jesus had died and that they had personally met him after his death. They sincerely believed they had personally conversed with him, eaten with him, and touched him, and were prepared to die for that belief. What they weren't prepared to die for was an ideology or set of beliefs passed on to them from some political or religious leader. The later Christian martyrs could possibly fit into that category. Probably a bit unfair, but to say that, but they were clearly acting on, what was passed on to them, if you like. However, with Jesus' disciples, it's different. They were prepared to die and did die because they had personally seen Jesus alive after his death. That points clearly to the disciples having actually seen him. Okay, another piece of circumstantial evidence is the conversion of skeptics. In the early days of Christianity, two of the early leaders of the way, as the early Christians called themselves, were people who had been unconvinced that Jesus was the Son of God. We heard earlier on this evening about Paul. When he was called Saul, he was a persecutor of Christians. What changed him to being a follower was seeing Jesus alive on the road to Damascus sometime after his death. The other former skeptic we know of is James, the brother of Jesus. Now, Jesus wasn't an only child. He had a number of brothers and sisters. His whole family, including his mother, initially tried to stop him in his mission. In Mark's Gospel, his whole family, presumably James included, come to get him. Mark says, when his family heard about this, that is his teaching, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he's out of his mind. That's Mark chapter 3, verse 20. Now, James isn't mentioned as a follower of Jesus in the Gospels. Yet in the early church, we know that James was a leading figure. Well, why the change? Well, we're told in Paul's letters that James too had seen Jesus alive after his death. James changed from being a skeptic to a believer after seeing the risen Christ. Okay, another piece of circumstantial evidence are some changes to key social structures. And I guess the best way of thinking about this is, why are Jews around today? Jews can trace their origins back to the tribal Middle East of 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. There were other people about at that time. Why is it then there are no people alive today who would call themselves Babylonians, Ammonites, Assyrians, Hittites, and so on? Well, I suppose the answer is in the social and religious structures that make Jews Jews. Jewish people have lived side by side with non-Jews for the last 2,000 years, but have remained distinctly different because of their own customs, laws, eating habits, religious practices, religious beliefs, and so on. To Jews, these are the things that make them who they are and are terribly important to them. Now, some have viewed the early Christians as just another Jewish sect. And in a sense, they were. However, they were different from those other Jewish sects that existed at that time. Those other sects didn't disagree with the fundamentals of Judaism. The first Christians were all Jews. We've got clear evidence that early after Jesus' death, that these Jewish Christians rejected many of the foundations of Judaism. Now, that was an enormous social leap and one that brought with it great personal risk to their lives. We've also got evidence that these changes weren't made lightly or easily by the early Jewish Christians. So what were they, these changes? Well, they stopped offering animal sacrifice. They eventually rejected the belief that keeping Moses' laws, not the Ten Commandments, but the other eating, social, and sacrifice laws that Jews believed was the way to be right with God. They changed their Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. They believed in a Trinity, one God in three forms. That was blasphemy to the Jews. They believed the Messiah had come. Jews were and are still waiting. And they initiated a new ritual called the Lord's Supper, a ritual that celebrates Jesus' victory over death. Why did the early Jewish Christians make these changes? Because their leaders had seen Jesus alive after his death, remembered his teachings, and were therefore compelled to make these changes. Okay, another piece of circumstantial evidence, I guess, is the emergence of Christianity. Now, earlier on this evening, we talked about how quickly after Jesus' death, Christianity caught hold and spread through the Roman world. Why did that happen? Equally importantly, why did Christianity survive, particularly when other religious fads we're aware of that existed in the Roman world didn't survive? Why didn't Christianity just fizzle out after a few decades? Well, the answer is the resurrection. A core of people witnessed Jesus alive after his death. The sources tell us that this core of people were transformed from illiterate fishermen, Jewish zealots, tax collectors, and other ordinary people to tireless advocates for the risen Jesus. As we saw earlier, they, the disciples, formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. They did all this because of the resurrection. Without the resurrection, there would have been no lasting Christianity. Frankly, without the resurrection, we wouldn't be here tonight. So I started this presentation by putting two statements up on the screen. There's a historical and rational basis for Jesus being the Son of God. There's a wealth of evidence to support that view. So to end, let's just briefly review what we've covered this evening. So, we stated that the Gospels and most of the letters of Paul are likely to provide an accurate account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. We stated that the view of today's historians is that these documents have been, on the whole, accurately preserved for us and haven't been subject to accidental or deliberate modification. We reviewed other historical information that was contemporary to but out with the Gospels. This provided information that didn't contradict what was in the Gospels and letters of Paul. We presented evidence demonstrating it was very likely that Jesus saw himself as the Son of God, and we suggested it was very unlikely that he saw himself in this way due to some psychological condition. And we also suggested that when the sources are reviewed, there's no evidence that Jesus either deliberately or unintentionally misled the followers. Okay, we presented evidence demonstrating it was very likely that Jesus was executed and died. We presented evidence it was very likely he was buried and that shortly afterwards his tomb was found to be empty. We looked at possible reasons for his tomb being empty. We suggested that the least unlikely explanation was that his body was no longer on earth. We looked at the historical basis for Jesus' appearance to the disciples. We found that this is regarded as a secure fact by most historians. And we reviewed what it was the disciples saw. We suggested that the least unlikely explanation was that the disciples saw, met, talked with, and ate with Jesus in bodily form after his death. Lastly, we reviewed circumstantial evidence for the resurrection, and we suggested that without the resurrection, it's likely that the disciples would not have died for the beliefs. Skeptics like Paul and James would not have been converted. A clear separation of Jewish Christians and Judaism would not have occurred. The early church would not have spread so quickly. Christianity would not have lasted to this day. Okay. Now, history is sometimes not an exact discipline. We can sometimes have difficulty saying with absolute certainty that something happened in the past at a particular time and that it happened in a particular way. Even today, with mass communication, controversy can rage relating to events that happened last week or a few years ago. For example, John F. Kennedy's assassination, Princess Diana's death, the Twin Towers, and so on. And I suppose it's the same with Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. I can't say with absolute certainty that the evidence I presented this evening is 100% correct. I can't say with absolute certainty, based on this, that Jesus is the Son of God. But I think what I can say is that Jesus being the Son of God is the most likely explanation of the pretty extensive evidence we've got. What I think I can say is, looked at rationally, the alternative explanations for the evidence are simply far less likely. Now, I'm sure some of you will be agreeing with this. I'm sure some of you will be thinking, isn't this a bit one-sided? Christian presents evidence for Christianity in church setting. Surely there's another point of view. Well, if I'd been sitting where you are when I was an agnostic, that's exactly what I'd be thinking. I did think that. However, my spiritual journey didn't end by reading The Case for Christ and a few Christian biographies on the life of Jesus. I trawled bookshops for books on atheism, I felt sure I'd find some atheistic stuff that would blow all this out the water. I scoured atheist websites, I read detailed hostile reviews of the case for Christ, I listened to and read books and articles by atheists. It's blooming depressing, but I still do it. I read the New Testament for myself. I read biographies and critiques of Jesus by non-Christians. And frankly, I'd encourage anyone with doubts about the material presented this evening to do exactly the same. And what was the result of all this research? Well, I think I can summarize this by saying I was an agnostic then, and I'm a Christian now. Okay, what we haven't discussed this evening is Jesus' message and what it means. What we haven't discussed is why a relationship with Jesus Christ and Jesus' message is important to you today. Now, you may or may not be glad to know I'm not going to start now. However, consider this. If Jesus is the Son of God, if Jesus is real, then his message is real too. In the last 2,000 years, countless lives have been positively transformed by Jesus' message and their relationship with Jesus Christ. And don't kid yourselves, if you truly accept Jesus' message, and I'm stressing the words, truly accept Jesus' message, it's always a positive transformation. So in conclusion, you don't owe it to yourselves to weigh up the evidence and decide what you think. If you do that and decide that Jesus is real, you don't owe it to yourselves to find out what his message is and start to experience that positive transformation in your life. Thank you. I'm going to do a question and answer session. Okay. Any questions? Okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll start it off by asking myself a question. You're obviously far too polite to ask this question. So, often people will ask me, that information I presented, is that why I'm a Christian? Well, the answer to that, I suppose, is yes and no. I suppose this information, I guess, got me into a position where I could consider the possibility of a relationship with Jesus Christ. Prior to that, I really thought it was for other people, as I indicated at the start of the presentation. So this got me into a position where I could consider the possibility of something like that happening. And of course, I'm sure some of you will be here, will know what I'm talking about. Stuff got interesting after that. So it did help, undoubtedly. And there's, as I say, there's millions of people out there with the same kind of issues. And there may be some people in here, I don't know, have these kind of questions. You know, they think they can't get out of their agnostic or atheistic state. Well, hopefully this might help get you into a position where you could consider a relationship with Jesus Christ. So, yes and no, it helped to get me there. Anyway, anyone got any questions?
I've got a question. If someone said to you, prove to me Jesus existed, how could you answer them without going through 80 minutes of presentation? What would you say inside a sort of 30 to 50 second reply?
Okay. Well, I mean, the stuff that impressed me was I went and I got all this evidence, right? I found all this evidence for Jesus being who he said he was. Now, what I was expecting to find out, then I decided, right, okay, I've got all this evidence, big pile, like, oh, that's fantastic. What I'll do now is I'll go and have a look at the evidence against. I was fully expecting to find a big pile like that and, one cancel the other out. What I found was evidence for, evidence against. Oh, not expecting that. So that had a big impression on me. And so I would say there is more evidence for Jesus being who he said he was than against. And if you want me to talk about it, I'm more than happy to spend 80 minutes talking about it. But that's what I would say. Does that answer your question? Sort of. maybe not.
If you don't mind sharing, how did you then become a Christian yourself?
Okay, right. What I did, I got to a position where I thought, I need to do something about this. So I did an Alpha course about 20 years ago. And I remember sitting at the Alpha course on the first night and thinking, gosh, if I hadn't done all this stuff beforehand, I wouldn't be back. But I had done all this research beforehand. So I stuck it out, and I got to the end of the Alpha course, and I thought, right, what are you going to do, Derek? What are you going to do? I thought, I still had loads of questions, yeah, but I decided I thought, I'll give it a go. I'll see what happens. I'll start going to church, and I'll start reading the Bible, start praying, trying to pray, not very well, and do what I thought Christians did, and see what happened. Well, here I am. So I didn't have any of these kind of these blinding light experiences. Now people do, and it's incredible hearing about them. I was talking to a guy in Croydon last year who had exactly that, and he was telling me he had this personal experience of meeting Jesus in his front room, and he didn't know what to do with it. It was a really powerful thing, and he ran away from it for months, but he couldn't keep running. So, it can be like that, but it wasn't like that for me. But then again, it's hardly surprising, everyone comes to faith in their own unique way. Yeah. It's God tailors it exactly for your own personality. And as I've said many times before, for a lot of people, this stuff, well, it's not there anymore, but this stuff is irrelevant because they just know it in their hearts. That's wonderful. But, there's cussed people, plenty of cussed people like me out there, who have a bit of difficulty with that, but so we'll come to faith in our own way. Does that answer your question? Anybody else?
Sorry, just to say that obviously your faith and your belief in your own journey means so much to you that you're now taking this message to as many people as you can.
Well,
so I think that speaks volumes in itself.
Well, it's one of these things, I came to faith. I came to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, and and it has transformed my life. I was an angry workaholic before, and I've still got a bit of a temper, if I'm honest. But I've had the edges knocked off it, and I can see it's self-indulgence really. But so I've had the corners knocked off me, and my relationships with my family, my kids, and people around me have improved immeasurably as a result of this. So I have experienced the transformation of things in my life. That's what waits you if you say yes to this. It's it's a very powerful thing, and I do this because when I'd been a Christian a couple of years, and I thought, there's millions of people like me out there. I took the time to dig into it because I was interested, but a lot of people, they're busy people, busy lives, and they've got kids and they've got family and so on and so forth. They just don't have time for this. So I thought it would be good to allow a way of collecting all this information from disparate sources and putting it into one presentation or one booklet, and allow people to make their own minds up. At least they've got the facts in front of them. Yeah, that's why I do it. Anything else? Thank you.
Have you had any response to your presentation from people that have become Christian through your presentation? Has anybody
Well, it just
come
so
back to you?
happens. It just so happens. It happened on Monday night. I was at Dewsbury Minster, and a lady came up to me and said, it's just knocked away the last few things that were preventing me from making a commitment. So it can. It usually happens the other way around. It usually is this kind of thing. I guess we'll get people into a position where they think, here, there might be something in this. Yeah, I need to go and find out a bit more about it. If it's going to transform my life, if it's going to do this, all these things that he's saying about, I really need to look into it in more depth. So I think it provides an urgency for doing that. That's the more common way. But it happened on Monday night. A lady came up to me and said, and we prayed into her, and she's in. So it can happen. It was absolutely wonderful to be part of that, as you can imagine. Anyway, so yes, it has happened. Thank you. Yes.
Well, thanks, Derek. That was amazing. So, with your family,
Mm-hmm.
what's the biggest evidence they see?
Me not being a grumpy old man, basically. Yeah, I mean, it's, my two older boys, I say boys, they're not boys, they're men, they're 35 and 37, but, they knew me before I was a Christian. My daughter's only 24, so she didn't really know me before I was a Christian, really. She was too young to know me as a Christian, but my boys have seen a big difference. They will freely admit, I'm nowhere near as, we call it crabbit in Scotland, and I'm nowhere nearly as, just as cross and bad tempered, and I just, a difficult person to live with. I'm an easier person to live with. That's the biggest difference, I would say. Well, from a personality point of view. I mean, there's obviously other things going on, but, in my head. And anyway. Anybody else? Have I bled you dry then? Fair enough.